March 5, 1942, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Dawn lay over the frozen rail yard as the guarded train stopped, steam drifting across the tracks. Warrant Officer Nakamura Toshio stepped down onto the snow. But it was not the rifles or the watchtower that seized his attention. Beyond the first belt of barbed wire stood a whitewashed hall with glass doors and a peaked roof, and above them a marquee with English titles, ringed in electric bulbs. An American theater, inside a prison camp. Before sailing, he had been told that capture meant blows, boots, and slow starvation, never light or laughing faces on posters. As the military police marched the Japanese prisoners toward the intake hut, Nakamura's gaze kept drifting back to that building. A stovepipe on its roof sent up a plume of smoke, and on the wind he caught a faint sweetness popcorn from a concession room he could not imagine. Around him, hammers rang from raw timber as barracks and mess halls rose in straight lines. The frame of a place built for defeated men. Years earlier in Geneva, diplomats had written rules saying prisoners must be housed, fed, and given recreation. But for Nakamura, those decisions existed only in this site, a theater marquee glowing above barbed wire, hinting that in nights to come the enemy would try to reach him, not with fists, but with moving pictures. In the winter of 1938, on a parade ground outside Hiroshima, a young naval conscript named Sato Hiroshi stood rigid in the cold, breath steaming in the air, while an instructor told him that capture was worse than death. A man who fell into enemy hands, the officer warned, would shame his ancestors and be beaten and starved by Western brutes who despised the Japanese race. Sato had never seen an American, but lectures and barracks gossip repeated the same image until it hardened into a single rule: no surrender. When war spread across the Pacific after December 1941, that creed traveled with every unit. On jungle ridges and coral beaches, Japanese companies fought until they were overrun, not until they chose to lay down their rifles. German formations in North Africa and Europe surrendered in their tens of thousands and would send more than 400,000 prisoners into American camps, while only a few thousand Japanese soldiers were ever shipped alive to the mainland, most of them unconscious or badly wounded and pulled from caves to hurt to die by their own hand or resist capture. Inside the office of the Provost Marshal General in Washington, the small size of this group did not make it an afterthought. Staff officers spread maps across desks and laid over them blueprints for a camp network that would meet Geneva Convention standards, barracks and infirmaries paired with chapels, canteens and assembly halls where prisoners could attend concerts, lectures, and moving picture shows. Site surveys in the American interior turned open fields into ordered sketches of streets, guard towers, and recreation yards, building spectacle into the layout of captivity. In Tokyo, propagandists who knew nothing of these designs continued to insist that anyone taken by Americans would vanish into rags, thin gruel, and forced labor, never imagining that for the rare Japanese prisoner who survived the journey, the deeper shock would be discovering that his captors meant to control him with rules, rations, and astonishingly, culture, and that the first flicker of Hollywood light behind barbed wire was already being planned an ocean away. July 10, 1942. The sun over Camp Fannin in East Texas beat down on fresh concrete as German and Italian prisoners swung hammers under guard. But it was not just barracks and watchtowers rising inside the wire. Near the center of the compound, carpenters raised a wooden shell with a raked floor and a blank wall facing benches. And some POs realized with disbelief that they were helping to build a theater. They had been marched into camp expecting only mud, fences, and shouted orders. Instead, a work detail one day unloaded crates from New York and Chicago, and inside lay reels, amplifiers, and the metal-bodied core of a 35mm projector, like the ones they had seen in cinemas before the war. That spring, regulations from the Provost Marshal General's office had ordered every major POW camp to open a canteen funded by prisoners' coupon purchases, and commanders quickly learned that those profits could be used to buy equipment that promised Comer compounds. At Fannin, the open-air theater, the prisoners, erected, seated close to 1,000 men, and boasted a stage with curtains and wiring strong enough to power a carbon arc lamp burning hot and white behind the projector's glass. Inspection reports from other posts soon mentioned similar spaces, halls where loudspeakers on wooden towers carried sound to the backbenches, and metal magazines spooled 20-minute lengths of nitrate stock through dependable machines. Army Special Services officers first used these setups to show training films and newsreels to American troops, and when no permanent auditorium existed, they loaded reels, screens, and portable projectors onto trucks and took them to remote branch camps for one-night shows. As the war lengthened, guards on quiet evenings began allowing selected groups of prisoners to share the same darkness and watch the United States flicker to life in grainy black and white, long before anyone in Washington planned to use movies to reshape the attitudes of Japanese captives. Camp cinemas had become routine, their projectors and benches already waiting for the day when men from the Pacific War would file into those rows and confront an America they knew only from propaganda, now glowing on a wall inside their prison. April 2, 1942. Snow lay in ridges along the tracks outside Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, when Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki stepped from a guarded car and saw, for the first time, the inside of the enemy's homeland. Catalogued as prisoner of war, number 1. He stared at the flag above the parade ground and felt the shame of survival in a navy that preached death before capture. Months earlier, after his midget submarine grounded off Pearl Harbor, he had been dragged half-conscious from the surf, expecting beatings and slow starvation. Instead, clerks at McCoy measured him in a heated room and issued winter clothing, blankets, soap, and a metal cup like the ones stacked for every other uniformed man, as later groups of Japanese prisoners followed from Pacific fronts. Through late 1942 and 1943, they found similar routines. Wait-in barracks stood in tidy rows beside mess halls serving meat, bread and coffee that startled men used to thin rice rations, and hospital wards with sulfa drugs and clean bedding treated wounds that might otherwise have meant quiet death at the front. Red Cross and Swiss delegates touring these compounds noted in dry reports that Axis prisoners in the United States often received steadier food, warmer clothing, and more reliable medical care than many civilians overseas. A contrast lost on the men behind the wire but clear to officials reading those files. Within this system, the Japanese formed a tiny minority scattered among thousands of Germans and Italians, separated not only by language but by an honor code that branded them cowards simply for being alive. They kept to the edges of barracks life, writing characters on scrap paper or sitting stiffly on bunks while the camp around them shuffled to meals, work details, and roll calls. Officers later observed that they responded with visible relief to humane treatment. Yet the prisoners struggled to reconcile each full tray and fresh bandage with the nightmares of American cruelty they had carried from home. Even in isolation, they could not avoid the wider rhythm of the compounds. Work parties passing fenced athletic fields where Germans chased a ball, swing music leaking from service clubs at night, bulletin boards advertising shows at post theaters for enlisted men, and, on rare evenings, for selected prisoners. Before any Japanese detail was marched into one of those halls to watch a Hollywood feature, the glow of jukeboxes behind glass and streams of men heading to ward games and concerts had already begun to chip away at their terror of captivity, preparing them for the moment when America itself would flicker to life on a screen behind barbed wire. January 1944 brought a deep, dry cold to central Wisconsin, the kind that made every footstep in the snow around Camp McCoy sound brittle. On a moonless evening, a column of Japanese prisoners in heavy coats shuffled through a gate they had never been allowed to pass before, flanked by American guards whose breath smoked in the air. They expected another work detail or inspection, but beyond the outer wire trucks waited, and beyond the trucks, the faint glow of town lights. Within the hour, they found themselves filed through the doors of a civilian cinema that had been cleared for a special showing, its marquee blazing against the winter sky, its lobby warm and smelling of popcorn, cigarettes, and wet wool. Ushers in uniforms that were not military took their tickets, and for men raised to believe captivity meant ditches and clubs. The true shock was not the rifles at their backs, but the ordinary ease of the crowding soldiers and prisoners, who jostled together on the aisles, laughing as they searched for seats. This had not been part of any original plan for them. Only in late 1943, once the flow of Axis captives had stabilized and routine took hold, did American officers begin to use the new theaters and projectors systematically for enemy audiences. At McCoy, by then home to the largest concentration of Japanese POWs on the mainland, selected groups marched out to town once a week while others stayed inside the stockade, sitting on rough benches in improvised camp cinemas where special services officers threaded 35mm reels onto humming machines. The lineups rarely traded in ambiguity. Patriotic melodramas unrolled scenes of upright small-town families and brave servicemen. Westerns showed sunburned sheriffs and wide unclaimed horizons. Comedies drew roars from the English-speaking ranks at pratfalls the Japanese only half understood. Between features came newsreels, assembly lines of bombers moving nose to tail, wheat fields cut by combines, crowds at war bond rallies cheering beneath cascades of paper streamers, all of it silently underscoring the industrial weight that lay behind the sentries at the doors. For the prisoners, language turned the experience into a puzzle assembled from music, expression, and gesture. Many followed only the broadest outlines of plot, the tight jaw of a hero, the slow collapse of a villain, a mother's relief when a son came home in uniform. Yet, even without the dialogue, something in the contrast began to register. The America they had been taught to imagine as a decadent, collapsing society appeared on the screen instead as confident and materially abundant, able to feed and entertain even its enemies. Walking back through the snow after these early movie nights, men who had once expected to die nameless on some jungle slope found themselves arguing quietly over what they had seen, weighing propaganda from home against the evidence flickering in their memories, and setting the stage for the next phase, when those same evenings in the dark would be shaped, less as a privilege and more as a deliberate tool of persuasion. February 1944. brought long darkness to Wisconsin. And inside the Post Theater, at Camp McCoy, the only light came from the projector beam cutting through cigarette smoke, as rows of Japanese prisoners sat beside Germans on wooden benches. In the rear stood an American intelligence officer in an overcoat, not watching the Hollywood drama on the screen so much as the faces turned up toward it, studying every flinch when a factory floor appeared, every quick whisper when the camera lingered on streets lined with automobiles. Swiss legation visitors had already filed reports noting that these men responded well to good treatment. Surprised at how quickly suspicion faded once rations, medical care and recreation proved equal to what many American enlisted men received. But the officer wanted to see belief shift with his own eyes. By this point in the war, staff in the Prisoner of War, Special Projects Division in Washington, were circulating memoranda arguing that such moments mattered more than any interrogation script, films, newspapers, and lecture series. They suggested, should not be treated merely as privileges to keep barracks quiet, but as instruments that could reveal the prosperity and social order behind American democracy in ways no lecture through an interpreter could match. After screenings, junior officers wandered the aisles, pausing beside knots of prisoners discussing scenes of family dinners, shops, or small houses, and listened for remarks that hinted at cracking stereotypes. 4 Japanese captives raised on tales of American degeneracy and collapse. The most unsettling part of these features was often not the story but the background, the size of a worker's lunch, the number of cars in a parking lot, the shelves piled behind a clerk's shoulder. Those quiet reactions convinced planners that nights in the dark could be shaped into something more deliberate, the screen itself becoming a silent lecturer pointing toward efforts to talk surrender, defeat, and life after the Emperor's War. June 1944. On a sunburned siding outside an Arkansas branch camp, a boxcar door slid open and a German prisoner watched American soldiers wrestle metal tins onto a dolly, each one stamped with studio names. The cans clanked as they rolled toward the camp gate, part of a cargo that included flour, uniforms, and mail sacks. Yet, it was the greasepencil scrawl on the lid's titles, real numbers, showtimes that marked them as something different. Dreams shipped into a world of wire and watched. Months earlier, in Washington, the War Department's Special Projects Division had carved out a film branch, first intended for German captives, to work with Hollywood studios on libraries of features, documentaries, and shorts cleared for security and propaganda value. From there, the reels moved along the same rail lines and truck routes that fed the Prisoner of War network, packed into schedules plotted alongside troop movements. By 1944, that network sprawled across more than 100 main and branch camps, holding roughly 400,000 Axis prisoners, with only a few thousand Japanese scattered among them, and special services officers logged thousands of miles hauling portable projectors, screens, and speakers to isolated work detachments where no permanent theater stood. Profits from camp canteens paid for equipment, timber, and paint, allowing prisoners themselves to build viewing spaces that ranged from open-air amphitheaters to enclosed halls, hung with blackout curtains to keep the images sharp. Each reel retained a presence that planners exploited, dented tins arriving with freight, penciled routing cards, rotation lists that sent the same Hollywood melodrama from German farmers in Texas, one week to Japanese sailors in Wisconsin, the next. What had begun as a novelty for prisoners had become, by the end of 1944, a routine of captivity, a logistical web that made cinema an accepted part of camp life and offered re-education planners a conduit through which more overt messages could soon be carried into barracks. Dark. January 1943. Heat clung to the dust-blown flats around Loveday in South Australia as a column of Japanese prisoners and civilian internees marched from their compound toward a low hall of corrugated iron. Too many. The idea of leaving the wire at dusk without blows or shouted orders felt stranger than the barbed perimeter itself. Inside, guards had hung blackout curtains and stretched a canvas sheet against one wall. When the generator coughed to life and the lamps snapped off, the first beam from a portable projector turned a hut built for confinement into a window on another world. Survivors later recalled the smell of hot dust and kerosene, the shuffle of boots in the dark, and the uneasy sensation of laughing, however cautiously, at the same gags as the men who kept rifles nearby. These picture shows at Loveday and other Dominion camps were irregular and crude, with propaganda shorts on Allied victories spliced before imported features, yet they carried the same message. Swiss inspectors noted in American installations, even those branded as the most fanatical enemies were sometimes treated under Geneva's ideal of decent care. For prisoners raised on warnings that capture abroad meant unending humiliation, the chance to walk beyond the compound, sit shoulder to shoulder, and watch a film without being singled out for abuse chipped at the certainty that the outside world wished only their destruction. In Pacific forward zones, small groups of captured sailors or soldiers encountered film in passing, crowded into makeshift theaters at processing centers in Hawaii or island bases where American training reels thundered across screens. There the images were harsher, carriers steaming in formation, Factories pouring out aircraft, maps whose arrows showed Japanese islands under threat. Yet even these brief exposures fed the same pattern emerging across 3 continents that the glow of a projector could pacify, unsettle, and begin to redraw how Japanese prisoners imagined the nations holding them. A realization Allied planners were preparing to fold into more formal schemes of reorientation. August 1944. The air inside the Camp McCoy Theater hung with smoke as the projector rattled through an American comedy and a line of Japanese prisoners sat along the back wall. When a clumsy office clerk on screen slipped and sent papers flying, the benches in front erupted in laughter from German POWs, and off-duty G.I.s, and to his surprise, Sergeant Miyata Kenji laughed too. For years he had been told that Americans were brutal, racially debased enemies. Now the faces under the studio lights looked human, and the shock lay in realizing that the same joke drew a response from him as from the men in uniforms around him. As showings settled into weekly routine through late 1944 and into 1945, that jolt repeated in quieter ways. Prisoners who had once memorized silhouettes of American ships now watched the houses and streets drifting behind Hollywood melodramas, searching for signs of a starving nation and instead seeing sidewalks, lawns, and hospital corridors that suggested comfort. In the barracks, some insisted that such scenes were fabrications, yet their own eyes and stomachs argued back each time they left the theater for warm stoves, regular meals, and parcels in the mailroom, while others stored away fragments no Japanese newsreel had shown them. Rows of automobiles, tractors on fields, soldiers joking with nurses. American interrogators noticed that questions about these glimpses slipped into conversations that formal interviews never managed to open. Men who had once answered in stiff slogans now asked whether American homes were that large, whether farms used many machines, whether women were outspoken. Each shared laugh in the dark, each hesitant query about a landscape or family dinner on screen, chipped at the wall of absolute difference that wartime propaganda had built, opening a narrow space in which Japanese prisoners could imagine the enemy's world as lived for planners in Washington as something that might soon be addressed more directly. June 1945. Hot wind pushed dust across the South Texas scrub as a new draft of Japanese prisoners filed through the gate at Camp Kennedy, expecting another stockade of wire, towers, and weary routine. One lieutenant slowed when he saw a board beside a barracks door. Its English word echoed in neat Japanese characters. School. Inside, desks stood under fans, blackboards waited clean, and on a table lay language sheets and copies of American news, for men taught that capture meant slow erasure. The idea that the enemy planned to teach them rather than simply lock them away felt almost unreal. The school at Kennedy was the visible end of decisions made months earlier in Washington. In early 1945, War Department officials, working with diplomats and information specialists, studied reports describing how Japanese prisoners reacted to humane treatment and to glimpses of American life on screen. The Prisoner of War Special Projects Division argued that these reactions could be guided and proposed a centralized experiment in reorientation for the small Japanese population in American hands, borrowing the outline of the German program but recognizing that emperor-centered loyalty and language barriers made the task more delicate. Camp Kennedy, already an internment and POW site, was chosen as the place to bring selected officers and non-commissioned officers together, men judged capable of influencing others in the barracks and later back home. Movie nights stopped being rare favors and became scheduled parts of a curriculum that also included English lessons, talks on government and labor, and supervised reading of American papers. Films chosen for these audiences lingered on councils, factories, and families in ordinary streets, images that instructors discussed afterward in small groups, inviting comparisons with shortages and rigid hierarchies in Japan. The aim was not purely humanitarian. As rumors of surrender began to ripple through Kennedy, the United States hoped these students would return to a ruined homeland, carrying memories of American power tied as much to law and everyday security as to guards and fences, a perspective occupation forces could build on once they stepped ashore. February 25, 1943. Featherston prisoner of war camp on New Zealand's North Island. Damp air settling over the barracks as Japanese prisoners filed into a parade ground where, on other evenings, guards had staged concerts and picture shows. That morning, instead of music or film, they faced an order to supply more men for labor details. Voices rose, then shouts, and when some refused to move, invoking a code that treated forced work for the enemy as dishonored, the tension that had coexisted uneasily with recreation snapped. Warning shots became a few. When the smoke cleared, one guard lay dead, and dozens of Japanese prisoners had been killed or wounded. Stark proof that no amount of diversion could erase the collision between Bushido ideals and captivity. A year later, in August 1944, at Kura, in New South Wales, that collision erupted again when hundreds of prisoners, many of them veterans steeped in the same ethic, charged the wire rather than accept a reorganization of the camp. Some using blankets and baseball gloves as makeshift armor, others carrying knives carved from scrap. The breakout failed at terrible cost. but its message was clear to Allied authorities across the Pacific world. Film shows and sports could calm some men. Yet for others, the prospect of continued imprisonment remained more unbearable than death. By the time Camp Kennedy's School for Reorientation screenings took shape in 1945, these lessons loomed in the background. Within American Wire, Japanese prisoners who had absorbed the same teaching about shame and surrender denounced those who attended classes and film nights as traitors, harassing them in barracks, staging informal boycotts, or sitting rigidly through reels only to mock them afterward as crude lies. Language sharpened the distance. Even when interpreters summarized plots or whispered commentary, rapid-fire exchanges on screen remained opaque, convincing some that Americans were hiding vital truths behind untranslated speech. Camp officers, aware of how quickly resentment could ignite, tempered their programs by mixing overtly political features with comedies, westerns, and musical reviews that needed little explanation. Planners in Washington adjusted their ambitions accordingly. Reports from Kennedy and other posts warned that no single melodrama or documentary would overturn years of indoctrination, especially among men whose honor codes still framed cooperation as betrayal. The Special Projects Division quietly shifted emphasis towards small discussion groups and carefully chosen opinion leaders who might, over months, translate what they had seen into more acceptable terms for their peers. Film remained part of the effort, but now, as one strand in a wider web of incentives, conversations, and daily experience, an instrument powerful enough to open cracks in certainty, yet to blunt, on its own, to shatter the hold of Bushido on men who still flinched at the thought of facing home with the stain of survival. August 15, 1945. Noon at Camp McCoy found Japanese prisoners assembled as an American officer read the news that Tokyo had accepted surrender terms. His English phrases translated into flat Japanese sentences. Men who had watched Hollywood melodramas from hard benches, seeing America bright and orderly while imagining their own cities under bombs, felt those images tilt. They no longer looked like taunts, but like rough previews of a world they might soon have to inhabit. In Washington, officers of the Prisoner of War, Special Projects Division, after 2 years observing how captives reacted to films of family life and public ritual, began to think on a different scale, asking how similar pictures might work, not on a few thousand men behind wire, but on a defeated nation. Through late 1945 and into 1946, as repatriation ships emptied American camps and ferried ex-prisoners across the Pacific, Allied occupation authorities in Tokyo and prefectural capitals built film sections under the Civil Information and Education Program. Newsreels and documentaries explained public health drives, land reform, and the new constitution. Westerns and melodramas, translated and subtitled, filled cinemas where propaganda had once demanded sacrifice, while shorts modeled everyday civic life. Distribution plans echoed earlier POW circulation charts, sending reels on circuits from city to provincial theaters, then to village halls and school auditoriums, for former captives who had first glimpsed such material. Under guard in overseas camps, the sight of familiar stars and stories on free Japanese screens carried an uncanny sense of repetition. The flicker they had once watched in the microcosm of prison life now washed over audiences in cities and market towns, blurring memories of captivity into the wider flow of American imagery. In that continuity, planners and prisoners could trace a line from experimental movie nights behind barbed wire to a cinematic occupation that shaped how millions of Japanese first saw their conqueror and their future after surrender. April 1946. Wind swept across San Francisco Bay as a transport ship eased away from the pier and turned toward Japan. A former prisoner watched the coastline shrink and tried to arrange his years in captivity into something he could explain. The first scenes came back. Snow at Camp McCoy, the humiliation of the intake exam under foreign eyes, the surprise of receiving a full meal and warm clothes from hands he had been taught to fear. Then the memories shifted to the camp theater where guards and prisoners sat together, breathing the same stale air while romances and war dramas flickered on a white wall, washing over faces that had once glared at each other through guns. Between that world of barracks, rations, and projected dreams and the distant glow he imagined over occupied Tokyo, he knew that his idea of the enemy had changed, though he could not yet say how. America, as he had seen it behind barbed wire, was neither the monster of wartime pamphlets nor the perfect land some films suggested, but a complicated country of power and ordinary lives. As the last line of coasts blurred into mist and night folded around the ship, he understood that the story of his war would live not only in scars and lost comrades, but also in reels of flickering light, those evenings when the enemy let him sit, watch, and briefly imagine another kind of world beyond the wire.